Across the modern world, few structures have stirred as much fascination, debate, and longing as the ancient temple that once stood in Jerusalem. Its stones have vanished, its courts lie buried beneath centuries of history, and yet its memory continues to define faith, scholarship, and imagination. When archaeologists sift through the soil of the Judean hills, or when historians examine the writings left behind by priests, pilgrims, and foreign rulers, they are all reaching toward an institution that shaped an entire civilization. This journey begins not with its destruction, but with the world in which the Second Temple rose, an era marked by empire, restoration, and the struggle to preserve identity. In the late period of Persian rule, after the exiles returned from Babylon, the newly rebuilt temple did not match the splendor of Solomon's original structure. The biblical texts reflect both hope and disappointment, describing a sanctuary that fulfilled ancient commands, yet lacked the visible majesty many had expected. Still, it served as the heart of worship, and its rituals restored rhythms that had nearly been lost. The offerings resumed, priests returned to their service, and pilgrims once again ascended the hill for festivals that bound the scattered people of Judea into a unified story. As dominion shifted from Persia to the Macedonian Empire, and eventually to the heirs of Alexander, the temple found itself at the crossroads of cultural forces. Hellenistic rulers brought new political pressures, and their attempts to reshape Judean customs stirred resentment. The crisis that erupted under Antiochus IV, whose interference struck the temple at its core, became a defining moment remembered in early Jewish histories. The cleansing and rededication that followed did more than restore worship. It reaffirmed the temple as the center of resistance, memory, and covenant. Yet, the temple's significance was not limited to moments of conflict. Daily life around it took on a character that mingled the ordinary with the sacred. Archaeological evidence from Judea shows a society organized around purity laws, pilgrimage patterns, and offerings that connected family farms to the sanctuary's great courts. Ancient streets, mikvehs, and ritual vessels found near Jerusalem speak to the preparation required to enter holy space. Even the presence of foreign troops or shifting political alliances could not erase the sense that this was the axis around which the nation's spiritual life turned. Historical writings from this period illuminate how deeply the temple influenced political thought. Josephus records that high priests navigated both religious responsibilities and the pressures of governing under foreign powers. Their authority extended beyond ritual. They oversaw economic systems tied to tithes, managed disputes, and represented the people before imperial administrators. This blending of sacred duty and political negotiation shaped the temple's identity, giving it a dual role as both a spiritual sanctuary and a national symbol. In this same era, new strands of Jewish literature began to flourish. The Dead Sea Scrolls, composed by communities who withdrew from Jerusalem, offer a rare window into the diversity of beliefs surrounding the temple. Some writings express deep reverence for its rituals, while others criticize the priesthood for corruption or impurity. These competing voices reflect the tension of a society that saw the temple as essential yet contested, revered yet vulnerable to human failings. Despite these conflicts, the temple remained a unifying presence during major festivals. Pilgrims journeyed from towns across Judea and beyond, carrying offerings and reciting ancient prayers. Their movements reveal how the temple structured the calendar itself, turning the seasons into markers of covenant memory. The scent of incense, the chorus of Levites, and the solemn processions formed an atmosphere that left deep impressions on those who traveled far to participate. Under the emerging rule of the Hasmonean dynasty, the temple took on renewed political meaning. Victories celebrated within its courts strengthened the legitimacy of leaders who claimed both royal and priestly authority. These developments reshaped the institution, creating a model of governance in which the temple served as the foundation for both worship and statecraft. The lingering tensions, however, foreshadowed later disputes that would surface under Roman rule. By the time Herod the Great undertook his monumental reconstruction, the temple had stood for centuries as both a sanctuary and a stage for historical upheaval. His project transformed it into one of the most awe-inspiring structures in the ancient world. Yet, beneath the grandeur, lay the same ancient questions about holiness, access, and identity that had shaped its earliest years. This opening glimpse into the world of the Second Temple lays the groundwork for understanding not only its physical structure, but the spiritual and cultural layers that defined what lay within. Its courts, its rituals, and the people who moved through them were part of a landscape shaped by memory and expectation, where the sacred was never far from political reality. To step toward the outer edges of the Second Temple is to enter a world of strict order and layered sanctity, where each space reveals something about how ancient Israel understood holiness. Although the original structure no longer stands, its layout is preserved through meticulous descriptions in the Mishnah, the writings of Josephus, and the archaeological remains of Herodian Jerusalem. These sources allow the contours of the courts to emerge with striking clarity, showing how every approach to the sanctuary was governed by both spiritual aspiration and carefully defined boundaries. The vast expanse surrounding the Temple Mount may seem at first like an architectural prelude, but it was here that pilgrims began the transformation from ordinary life to ritual readiness. Mikveh installations carved into the limestone slopes testify to the importance of purification before entering sacred precincts. Many of these immersion pools show signs of heavy use, their steps worn smooth by countless feet. This physical journey, from unprepared to purified, mirrored the inner transition that worshippers were expected to undergo, reinforcing the notion that approaching the temple was not merely a matter of geography, but a movement toward holiness. At the threshold of the inner enclosure stood the soreg, the low stone barrier whose purpose was both practical and symbolic. Greek inscriptions discovered in Jerusalem warned non-Jews not to proceed beyond it, echoing the temple's role as a sanctuary set apart. These warnings reflect a tension between the universal draw of the sacred and the covenantal boundary that defined the identity of Israel. They also illuminate why later conflicts, such as those recorded by Josephus during the Roman period, often centered around perceived violations of this boundary. Entering forbidden space threatened not only ritual order, but the integrity of the nation itself. Within the soreg lay the court of the Gentiles, a name familiar today, yet originally far broader in meaning. It functioned as a gathering place, a teaching space, and an environment where commerce related to sacrifices took place. Historical accounts describe the exchange of currency, the sale of animals for offerings, and debates among various groups of teachers and scholars. This activity reveals a temple far more alive and complex than the quiet, idealized visions often imagined in later centuries. It was a place where spiritual longing intersected with practical necessity, and where the mundane served the sacred. Deeper still, one encountered the court of the women, which, despite its name, welcomed both men and women for certain rituals and festivals. Its architectural features, described in early Jewish texts, included chambers designated for vows, offerings of wood for the altar, and storage of oil and grain. This court also played a role in major celebrations such as the water-drawing ceremony mentioned in rabbinic literature, where music and dancing transformed the space into one of communal rejoicing. The existence of such events demonstrates that the temple was not solely a site of solemn sacrifice, but one of vibrant spiritual expression, shaping the rhythm of public life. Moving further inward led to the court of Israel and the court of the priests, where access became increasingly restricted. The court of Israel served as the place where laymen observed rituals performed on their behalf. It was here that worshippers witnessed the daily offerings and festival sacrifices, connecting participants to a liturgy that had its roots in ancient commands. The court of the priests, elevated above the rest, contained the great bronze laver used for purification and the massive altar where sacrifices were offered. Archaeological parallels from other Near Eastern temple complexes highlight the consistency of such arrangements, underscoring the continuity between Israel's traditions and broader ancient ritual patterns, even as the temple articulated a unique theological vision. The altar itself, built according to dimensions preserved in Jewish sources, dominated the priestly court. Its location, form, and function were essential to the entire system of sacrifices, which encompassed offerings for thanksgiving, atonement, and communal festivals. The smoke rising from its surface marked the visible intersection between earth and the divine, a theme echoed in biblical and early Jewish writings. Each sacrifice was not merely a transaction, but a symbolic act woven into the memory of Israel's covenant history. These layered courts and the boundaries between them form a map of how holiness was conceived. Access to the innermost sanctum was limited not by social rank alone, but by ritual state and sacred vocation. Even the architecture communicated theological meaning. As one moved deeper into the temple complex, the world narrowed, noise diminished, and the purpose of the journey sharpened. The progression served as a physical representation of the spiritual ascent described in ancient psalms, where drawing near to the divine presence required intention, purity, and reverence. The daily movements of thousands, pilgrims, priests, Levites, and merchants gave life to these spaces. While the enclosing walls and gates provided structure, the people themselves animated the temple's meaning. Every court echoed with stories of devotion, dispute, celebration, and longing, creating an atmosphere where personal prayers mingled with national identity. What survives today, inscriptions, architectural fragments, and literary witnesses, offers enough to reconstruct the temple's grandeur, yet leaves room for the mystery that has always surrounded it. These outer courts formed the threshold to deeper sanctity, spaces where worship began but did not end. At the heart of the Second Temple stood those who tended its rituals, guarded its sanctity, and interpreted its laws. The priestly families whose lineage traced its origins to ancient commands. Their presence shaped every aspect of temple life, from the daily offerings to the most solemn festivals. Through their traditions, garments, and responsibilities, the priesthood embodied the continuity of Israel's covenantal memory. Understanding their world is essential for understanding what unfolded inside the temple itself. The priestly system was far from simple. Biblical texts describe the division between the high priest, the ordinary priests, and the Levites, a pattern that persisted and evolved across centuries. Later writings such as Josephus and the Mishnah provide detailed glimpses into how these roles functioned during the Second Temple period. Levites served as singers, guards, and assistants, while priests performed offerings, maintained the sanctuary, and oversaw rituals of purification. These groups formed an intricate hierarchy, each bound to rules governing purity, lineage, and service. Lineage, above all, determined eligibility. Genealogical records were carefully guarded, and disputes over ancestry could erupt into political conflict. Josephus recounts episodes where questionable priestly claims led to accusations, ousters, or renewed examinations of family archives. This emphasis on bloodline reveals how seriously holiness was understood. The sanctity of the temple demanded that those who ministered within its courts belonged to families designated generations earlier. Even minor deviations from purity laws could bar a priest from service until restoration rituals were completed. Purity itself became a defining marker of priestly identity. Texts from Qumran, especially those produced by groups critical of Jerusalem's priesthood, highlight how debates over purity shaped religious life. Some sectarian writings accuse the temple establishment of ritual negligence, while others reveal alternative interpretations of purity laws. These disagreements illuminate a world where theology, politics, and daily actions were deeply interconnected. To dissenting voices, improper priestly conduct threatened not merely ritual correctness, but the spiritual welfare of the entire nation. Yet, for most worshippers, the priesthood was the visible face of faith. Priests conducted the morning and evening offerings, tended the altar's fire, and ensured that sacrifices met the required standards. They examined animals for blemishes, instructed pilgrims, and maintained the rhythm of ritual time. The Levites, meanwhile, performed music that accompanied the offerings, their voices and instruments forming an auditory tapestry described in early Jewish texts. These soundscapes, though lost to history, reflect how ceremony shaped the sensory experience of worship. The garments worn by priests added another layer of symbolism. Ancient descriptions echoed by Josephus detail the tunics, sashes, turbans, and special vestments set apart for service. Their fabric and colors signified purity and dignity, linking the priesthood to the sanctuary's sacred furnishings. The high priest's attire carried the greatest symbolic weight. The breastplate, with its 12 stones representing the tribes, the ephod, with its intricate design, and the gold plate inscribed with words signifying holiness. Each element was more than decoration. It declared that the bearer acted on behalf of the entire nation before the divine. Priests also served as interpreters, mediating between written law and lived practice. Their decisions on matters of purity, sacrifice, and festival observance shaped daily life across Judea. Archaeological finds, such as ritual vessels, stoneware, and inscriptions, reveal how their rulings influenced households far from Jerusalem. What occurred in the temple's courts radiated outward, affecting village practices and shaping community identity. The temple's laws were not confined to its immediate surroundings. They defined the rhythms of markets, farming practices, and family routines. The role of the high priest during this era was especially complex. Under foreign rule, he acted not only as spiritual leader, but also as a political figure responsible for representing Judea before imperial authorities. His office fused ritual authority with administrative responsibility, a combination that sometimes drew criticism. Some texts reflect suspicion toward certain high priests, especially those perceived as aligning too closely with foreign powers. Others highlight the dignity and solemnity of the office, especially during major festivals when the high priest's presence signified national unity. The priesthood's involvement in economic matters further strengthened its influence. The temple treasury managed tithes, offerings, and funds used for upkeep, employing officials who oversaw storage and distribution. These systems supported both daily rituals and large-scale projects, including repairs and new construction. Inscriptions from other ancient temple economies offer parallels, showing how sacred institutions often became economic centers. Within Judea, this reality shaped political alliances and rivalries, with control of the temple's resources becoming a point of tension among competing factions. Despite internal disputes and external pressures, the priesthood remained the backbone of temple life. Their daily actions, often unseen by the crowds in the outer courts, sustained the rituals that defined the sanctuary's meaning. Through their movements, prayers, and decisions, the concept of holiness was made tangible. Even today, fragments of ossuaries bearing priestly names, inscriptions referencing priestly families, and ancient texts discussing their duties preserve echoes of a world where sacred responsibility and communal identity intertwined. This deep structure of priestly life formed the living framework of the Second Temple. Without their constant vigilance over purity, lineage, ritual, and interpretation, its courts would have been silent and its meaning dimmed. The temple was not sustained by architecture alone, but by those who understood themselves as guardians of a covenant reaching back to distant ancestors. As one moves into the more central courts of the Second Temple, the world shifts from the broad gathering spaces of pilgrims to the structured rhythms of ritual life. These inner courts, particularly the court of the women, the court of Israel, and the court of the priests, formed a living environment where devotion, music, sacrifice, and communal memory wove together into an unbroken liturgical cycle. Their design and functions are preserved through ancient writings and archaeological parallels, allowing us to reconstruct not only what stood there, but what these spaces meant to those who entered them. The court of the women served as one of the most vibrant and accessible areas of the inner sanctuary. Despite its name, it welcomed both men and women for certain ceremonies and offerings. According to the Mishnah, this court contained 4 monumental chambers in its corners, each designated for specific ritual functions. One chamber held the wood used on the altar. Another was for those who took Nazirite vows. A third safeguarded oil and grain offerings. And the fourth served as a holding area for ritually unclean priests who awaited purification. These rooms reveal a court deeply connected to the practical management of sacred life. Inscriptions and literary references attest to the presence of collection boxes for charitable donations positioned around this court. contributions supported both the temple's upkeep and aid for the poor, integrating acts of generosity into the physical structure of worship. Festivals intensified this environment even further. Rabbinic descriptions of the water-drawing celebrations, echoed in later traditions, recount nights illuminated by torchlight, accompanied by music, dancing, and communal joy. Though details vary across sources, the consistent theme is a court transformed by devotion, where sacred ceremony and shared celebration blended seamlessly. Beyond this lively environment lay the court of Israel, a narrower space marking the threshold between lay worshippers and the priestly domain. Here, men from the community stood during offerings, observing the rituals performed on their behalf. This court underscored the distinction between participation and service. Worshippers could approach, witness, and pray, but the sacred tasks remained the exclusive responsibility of the priestly class. The architectural layout reinforced this theology. Stepwork and stone balustrades delineated physical limits, turning the approach to the sanctuary into a measured ascent. The court of the priests, elevated above the court of Israel, formed the operational center of sacrificial worship. The great bronze laver, or its stone successor in later periods, stood within this court, providing water for ritual purification. Its placement emphasized the principle that purity preceded every sacred act. The massive altar dominated the space, its dimensions preserved in rabbinic descriptions that align with earlier biblical commands. Ramps, rather than steps, led to its upper platform, enabling priests to ascend without compromising modesty or purity laws. Sacrifices offered on the altar followed a pattern deeply rooted in ancient tradition. The morning and evening offerings framed each day, while additional sacrifices marked Sabbaths, festivals, and special vows. The scent of burning incense from the inner sanctuary mingled with the smoke rising from the altar, forming a sensory backdrop for the priest's work. These rituals were accompanied by Levite music, an element attested by multiple sources, including Josephus and later Jewish writings. Instruments, choirs, and recitations created an immersive soundscape that elevated the solemnity of the offerings. The interplay between sound and ritual carried significant meaning. Music bridged the gap between the visible and the unseen, echoing the belief that worship resonated beyond the physical structure. Psalms used in temple liturgy preserved the emotional and theological range of these moments, from lament to exaltation. Even today, these texts offer insight into how worshipers experience the sacred environment, not as a static backdrop, but as a dynamic realm where human voices rose in response to divine presence. Along the edges of the priestly court stood additional chambers and structures mentioned in early Jewish literature. Some were used for storing utensils, others for preparing offerings or housing items dedicated to the temple. These spaces reflect the operational complexity necessary to maintain continuous rituals. Sacrifice required not only theological intent, but logistical precision: wood for the altar, vessels for libations, salt for offerings, and garments for priests. Everything had a designated place, underscoring a worldview in which order mirrored the order of creation itself. Archaeological remains from sites associated with the priesthood, including stone vessels and inscribed ossuaries, shed further light on daily life within these courts. These artifacts point to a culture in which purity extended beyond the temple walls, influencing household practices and community norms. Families preparing for pilgrimage or offering would adopt the purity standards modeled by the priests, creating a shared ritual consciousness throughout Judea. The progression from the court of the women to the court of the priests reveals a journey defined not only by physical boundaries, but by increasing intentionality. Each step narrowed the focus from communal celebration to sacred duty, from public gathering to priestly service. These courts formed a world where every sound, scent, and movement contributed to the meaning of worship. Pilgrims experienced them as thresholds of holiness, while priests understood them as the arena where covenant responsibilities were fulfilled. Though centuries have passed, the descriptions preserved in ancient texts allow the inner courts to rise again in the imagination. Their atmosphere, structured, reverent, and alive, provides context for the deeper mysteries waiting beyond the sanctuary doors. At the center of the temple's daily rhythm stood the altar and the offerings that sanctified time itself. To understand what truly occurred within the Second Temple, one must grasp how every hour of the day was woven into a pattern of ritual, prayer, and symbolic renewal. Time in the temple was not measured merely by rising and setting suns. It was shaped by cycles of sacrifice that connected heaven and earth through the work of human hands. The foundational offering, the perpetual burnt offering, framed each day with unbroken continuity. One was offered at dawn, the other toward the evening, marking the boundaries of sacred time. Ancient sources describe these offerings as expressions of collective devotion, a daily reaffirmation of covenant identity. Pilgrims who entered the courts often synchronized their prayers with these moments, knowing that the smoke rising from the altar represented the nation's continual dedication. Early Jewish writings speak of this rhythm as an anchor that stabilized the spiritual life of the people. Yet the daily offering was only the beginning. Sabbaths brought additional sacrifices that heightened the day's sanctity. Festivals introduced complex sequences of offerings, each with its own symbolism drawn from biblical commands. During Passover, the slaughter of lambs in the priestly court created an immense scene of preparation and remembrance. During the Feast of Weeks, offerings of grain and first fruits expressed gratitude for the harvest, binding agricultural life to the temple's sacred center. The Feast of Booths, with its elaborate libation ceremonies described in rabbinic sources, turned the temple into a landscape of joy and renewal. Such rituals shaped not only the temple's calendar, but the people's perception of time. Texts like Jubilees and the calendars found among the Dead Sea Scrolls reveal debates about how sacred time should be calculated. Some groups followed a solar calendar, others a lunar one, leading to disagreements about the correct days for festivals. These disputes were more than technical. They reflected differing understandings of cosmic order. To those at Qumran, for instance, proper timekeeping was inseparable from divine favor, and they believed the Jerusalem authorities had strayed from the true rhythm of creation. The temple's rituals also reflected ancient agricultural cycles. Offerings tied to the harvest seasons connected worship to the land's fertility. Barley and wheat, wine and oil, all had their place on the altar. This bond between land and sanctuary is echoed in biblical texts describing the Promised Land as a place of divine provision. By offering the first portion of each harvest, the people expressed gratitude and acknowledged dependence on the divine. These rituals affirmed that the temple's holiness extended beyond its walls into farms and fields across Judea. One of the most intriguing elements of the daily rites was the incense offering performed inside the sanctuary. Only priests entered this sacred chamber where they burned a carefully measured blend described in ancient tradition. The rising fragrance symbolized prayers ascending, a theme echoed in Psalms and later Jewish writings. Because this ritual took place out of public view, it carried a sense of mystery, reinforcing the idea that certain aspects of divine worship remained hidden, accessible only to those designated by lineage and purity. The salt used in offerings, often overlooked in modern retellings, carries its own symbolic weight. Ancient texts speak of salt as a sign of covenant, representing enduring fidelity. Every sacrifice, whether animal or grain, was accompanied by salt, underscoring the permanence of the bond between Israel and the divine. Archaeological finds of salt chambers near later temple sites mirror this practice, suggesting that ritual purity and preservation were deeply intertwined. Within this intricate system, the priests functioned not merely as facilitators, but as stewards of sacred time. Each step, examining offerings, tending fires, ensuring proper sequence, required precision. Mistakes were taken seriously, as early Jewish writings emphasized the consequences of incorrect ritual performance. The temple's sanctity demanded careful attention, and the priest's diligence shaped the spiritual foundation of the nation. Yet, sacred time extended beyond the daily rituals. Moments of crisis or celebration could introduce extraordinary offerings. Historical accounts describe sacrifices offered during times of national danger or thanksgiving after military victories. These events reveal how the temple functioned as the spiritual center of communal life, responding to the emotional and political atmosphere of the nation. The altar became a place where historical memory was shaped, recorded, and embodied in ritual action. The tension surrounding sacred time becomes clearer when examining conflicts recorded in historical sources. Sectarian groups, feeling the temple leadership had deviated from true purity or proper observance, withdrew to pursue alternate ways of marking time. The Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, describe an independent priestly calendar aligned with their interpretation of ancient commands. These disagreements show that the temple was not only a place of unity, but a focal point of intense theological debate. For the vast majority of worshippers, however, the temple's liturgical cycle provided stability in a changing world. Roman occupation, political shifts, and social challenges could alter the external landscape, but the daily offerings continued, anchoring the people in the constancy of sacred tradition. Pilgrims arriving for festivals stepped into a rhythm older than empires, older than kings, and grounded in the earliest layers of Israel's story. Understanding these rituals reveals how deeply the temple shaped the passage of time in Judea. Time was not merely passing, it was sanctified, structured, weighed, and renewed. Every day, week, month, and season carried meaning that found its center at the altar. This sacred rhythm prepared the way for what lay within the sanctuary itself, where the mysteries of divine presence were encountered in a more intimate realm. Beyond the courts and the altar, past the rhythms of daily offerings and the movements of priests and pilgrims, stood the sanctuary building itself, the architectural heart of the Second Temple. This structure, consisting of the holy place and the innermost chamber, embodied the theological core of ancient Israel's worship. Its design drew upon centuries of tradition, while also reflecting the unique religious vision that set Israel apart from the surrounding cultures of the Near East. Inside this sacred space stood the furnishings that connected ritual action to cosmic meaning, each item charged with symbolic depth and historical continuity. The holy place, known in ancient descriptions as the Haikal, functioned as the central chamber accessible only to priests who met strict purity requirements. Unlike the sprawling outer courts, this chamber was intimate, enclosed, and filled with objects whose design and arrangement reflected an understanding of the universe shaped by covenant theology. Ancient texts describe its walls, its height, and its orientation, emphasizing that its proportions were not arbitrary, but rooted in patterns inherited from earlier sanctuaries. The building echoed the design of the wilderness tabernacle, preserving ancient architectural memory across generations. One of the most striking objects in this chamber was the menorah, the golden lampstand. Its form, described in biblical tradition and echoed in the accounts of later historians, featured branches representing almond blossoms, a motif deeply tied to themes of life, vigilance, and divine watchfulness. The menorah burned continuously, tended each morning and evening by priests who ensured its flames remained steady. Scholars note that its perpetual light symbolized the ongoing presence of the divine and the illumination of sacred wisdom. Coins and carved reliefs discovered in Judea reflect the menorah's powerful place in cultural identity, showing that this object was not merely functional, but emblematic of the people's spiritual heritage. Opposite the menorah stood the table of the bread of the presence. Each week, 12 loaves were placed upon it, representing the tribes of Israel. Ancient writings emphasize that these loaves were not offerings consumed by the divine, but symbols of covenant fellowship, later eaten by the priests. Their renewal every Sabbath underscored the constancy of divine provision and relationship. The table itself, constructed of acacia wood overlaid with gold, echoed the craftsmanship described in earlier biblical traditions. Archaeological parallels from other ancient temples show similar tables used for ritual offerings, but none carried the same covenantal symbolism that defined the temple's design. Near the entrance to the inner chamber stood the golden altar of incense. This small yet significant object played a central role in the daily worship performed by the priests. Each morning and evening, incense was burned upon it, producing a fragrant cloud that filled the holy place. The precise blend of spices described in ancient tradition was considered sacred, reserved exclusively for temple use. Early Jewish writings portray incense as a bridge between the visible and the unseen, its rising smoke symbolizing the prayers of the people. This ritual, performed beyond public view, infused the sanctuary with an atmosphere that blended material action with spiritual meaning. The placement of these three objects, the menorah, the table of the bread of the presence, and the altar of incense, was deliberate. Their arrangement formed a symbolic representation of creation, covenant, and communion. The menorah brought light, the table represented life and sustenance, and the incense altar marked the ascent of devotion. Together, they depicted a world ordered by divine presence. Scholars note that similar symbolic structures appear in ancient Near Eastern temples, but the Second Temple's sanctuary redefined these motifs through the lens of Israel's covenantal identity. Access to the holy place required more than physical entry. Priests had to undergo purification, don sacred garments, and adhere to strict rules governing conduct and intention. These requirements, recorded in early Jewish texts, emphasized that holiness was both a state and a process. The sanctuary was not merely a room. It was a realm distinct from ordinary life, where the boundary between human and divine grew thin. Some sectarian writings describe longing for a pure sanctuary or critique what they viewed as improper ritual performance, revealing the intensity with which different groups perceived the sanctity of this space. The sanctuary's design incorporated elements that connected earth to heaven. The veil leading to the inner chamber, adorned in colors symbolizing the sky and sea, represented the boundary of creation. Its fabric served as a visual reminder of the divide between the human realm and the dwelling place of the divine. Accounts from later writings describe its vast size and intricate weaving, suggesting craftsmanship that required immense skill. Although the veil is known primarily through literary sources, its symbolic meaning resonates across centuries, reflecting a belief that sacred architecture could embody cosmic order. The sound within the holy place would have differed dramatically from the lively courts outside. Here, the noises of sacrifice and crowds faded, replaced by the quieter rituals of tending lamps, placing bread, and offering incense. This contrast underscored the transition from communal worship to priestly mediation. Even the lighting within the chamber carried meaning. The glow of the menorah, reflecting off golden surfaces, created an environment where ritual action unfolded in a soft, steady radiance. The sanctuary's atmosphere was not theatrical, but reverent, shaped by centuries of tradition and the disciplined movements of those entrusted with its care. Archaeological finds from the region, stone vessels, ritual tools, inscriptions, provide glimpses of the craftsmanship and purity practices that would have supported the sanctuary's work. Though none of the original furnishings survive, their descriptions in ancient texts allow a reconstruction that is both precise and evocative. Each piece served not only a ritual purpose but also communicated a theological truth. The sanctuary was a microcosm of the created world, ordered by divine intention and illuminated by sacred light. The holy place represented a threshold, a point of transition between the outer courts, alive with sound and motion, and the innermost chamber where mystery deepened. What occurred within this chamber set the tone for the entire temple's spiritual significance. It was a place where history, theology, and ritual converged, preparing the way for the mysteries concealed behind the veil. Beyond the holy place lay responsibilities that only one person in Israel could perform. Among the priests, the high priest stood alone, carrying a role that combined ritual precision, national representation, and symbolic weight. His presence shaped the meaning of the sanctuary's deepest spaces, especially during moments when he alone stepped beyond the veil to perform rites that affected the entire nation. To understand what was truly inside the Second Temple, one must understand the high priest, not merely as an official, but as the living embodiment of Israel's covenantal identity. His garments were the first sign of this elevated responsibility. Ancient descriptions emphasize that these vestments were not simply ceremonial clothing, but carried profound symbolic meaning. The ephod, woven with threads of blue, purple, scarlet, and gold, reflected the colors associated with creation and divine majesty. Upon his shoulders rested two stones, inscribed with the names of the tribes of Israel, signifying that he bore the entire nation in his intercession. The breastplate, mounted with 12 precious stones, echoed this theme in even greater detail. Each stone represented a tribe, forming a mosaic of identity set upon his chest. Scholars have noted that these stones link the high priest's role to ancient Near Eastern traditions of royal and priestly regalia. Yet, the Israelite version transformed such imagery into expressions of covenant fidelity. Attached to the breastplate were the mysterious objects referred to in biblical tradition as the Urim and Thummim. Their exact nature has been lost to history, but early writings portray them as instruments through which the high priest sought divine guidance. Though their usage faded in later periods, their symbolic presence persisted, representing the idea that the high priest stood at the intersection of human deliberation and divine revelation. Even without clear archaeological evidence, the long memory of these objects reflects their significance in Israel's religious consciousness. The high priest's daily duties inside the sanctuary included tending the menorah, burning incense, and participating in the renewal of the bread of the presence. But these activities, important as they were, did not fully define his office. His most solemn responsibility came on the Day of Atonement, the single day each year when he entered the innermost chamber behind the veil. Early Jewish texts, particularly the Mishnah, preserve detailed accounts of his preparation, days of seclusion, ritual immersion, instruction, and prayer. Every step was designed to ensure that he approached the divine presence with purity and clarity of intention. On that day, the rituals unfolded with profound theological meaning. The high priest offered sacrifices for himself and for the people, acknowledging that even the holiest among the priests required atonement. He sprinkled blood upon the mercy seat's former location, creating a symbolic act of purification for the sanctuary. Although the Ark of the Covenant was not present in the Second Temple era, as ancient sources attest, the ritual retained its significance through continuity with earlier tradition. The absence of the Ark reshaped the experience of the Holy of Holies, but it did not diminish the solemnity of the rites performed there. The high priest also sent a scapegoat into the wilderness, a ritual that ancient writings describe with vivid detail. This act symbolized the removal of the nation's sins, carried away to a desolate place, beyond the boundaries of cultivated life. Some sectarian texts, such as those from Qumran, offer alternate interpretations of this ritual, revealing the diversity of theological perspectives surrounding the temple service. Yet, all traditions acknowledge the central importance of the Day of Atonement as a moment of national renewal. The psychological burden borne by the high priest on this day cannot be overstated. His performance was seen as crucial for the nation's well-being. Ancient accounts record that the people waited with solemn anticipation, aware that the success of the ritual carried implications for their future. The tension of this moment permeated the temple's courts, shaping the emotional landscape of late Second Temple Judaism. Even historical writings by Josephus, though colored by his own experiences, reflect the sense of awe that accompanied this annual rite. Beyond the Day of Atonement, the high priest's political role shaped the temple's function within Judea. Under Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman rule, the high priest served as a mediator between the people and imperial authorities. His appointment, at times influenced by foreign rulers, sometimes sparked controversy. Rivalries between priestly families, documented in various sources, reveal that the office was not merely spiritual, but deeply entwined with power and governance. These tensions contributed to broader conflicts during the Second Temple period, including disputes that influenced sectarian movements. Archaeological remains associated with priestly families, such as inscribed ossuaries, provide a glimpse into their lineage and social standing. These artifacts, combined with textual references, show that priestly households often occupied prominent positions within Jerusalem's upper society. Their roles extended into legal, economic, and educational spheres, shaping the daily life of the city. The high priest, at the pinnacle of this hierarchy, embodied both spiritual authority and civic leadership. The sanctity surrounding his office also created expectations of personal integrity and ritual precision. Early Jewish writings emphasized the strict requirements placed upon him, from dietary rules to marriage restrictions. Deviations from these expectations sometimes led to public outcry or sectarian dissension. Yet, despite these controversies, the office continued to function as the stabilizing force at the center of Israel's worship. Through the high priest's actions, the sanctuary became a place where the nation confronted its history, identity, and moral condition. His entrance into the Holy of Holies represented not only a ritual obligation, but an encounter with the core of Israel's faith. Even in the absence of the ark, the act carried weight because it preserved the memory of divine revelation. The high priest's role, bridging the divide between the sacred and the everyday, infused the temple with meaning that extended far beyond its physical structure. His presence prepared the way for the deeper mysteries within the temple's innermost chamber, a space defined not by what was seen, but by what was remembered and believed. The innermost chamber of the Second Temple, the Holy of Holies, was a place defined not by what stood within it, but by what did not. In the era of the First Temple, this chamber housed the Ark of the Covenant, with its golden cherubim, the symbolic throne of the divine presence. But by the time of the Second Temple, ancient sources agree that the Ark was gone. Its disappearance shaped the entire character of this sacred space, giving rise to new interpretations of holiness and transforming the nature of Israel's encounter with the divine. According to early Jewish writings, the Holy of Holies in the Second Temple contained only a foundation stone, sometimes called the Even HaShatia, the foundation stone. Josephus and later rabbinic tradition describe it as a natural rock formation that protruded slightly above the ground. Upon this stone, the high priest sprinkled blood during the Day of Atonement, reenacting rites that originated in the era when the Ark had been present. The stone served as both memory and marker, linking the rituals of the Second Temple to the sacred narratives of earlier centuries. The absence of the Ark raises essential questions about continuity and change. Without the Ark's presence, the Holy of Holies no longer housed the physical symbol of the covenant given at Sinai. Some writings suggest that the divine presence remained, though in a form less visibly associated with earlier manifestations. Others reflect a sense of longing, an awareness that something once central to the nation's identity was now remembered rather than seen. Yet the rituals continued, grounded not in physical objects but in faith and tradition. The chamber's emptiness became part of its meaning. Holiness no longer depended solely on sacred artifacts, but on the continuity of worship itself. Descriptions of the chamber emphasize its simplicity. Its walls, dimensions, and coverings followed ancient specifications, yet its emptiness created a stark contrast with the richly furnished holy place outside. The vast veil separating the two chambers symbolized the boundary between human access and divine mystery. Early writings portray this veil as woven with colors mirroring the sky and sea, reflecting a symbolic representation of creation. When the high priest passed beyond it, once each year, he crossed not merely into a room, but into the theological heart of Israel's worldview. The Holy of Holies also served as a spiritual axis, a place where heaven and earth were believed to meet. Some early Jewish texts, including those found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, describe the temple as a reflection of a heavenly sanctuary. In this view, the earthly Holy of Holies was a shadow of a greater reality. This idea appears in later writings as well, showing how the temple's innermost chamber shaped conceptions of divine dwelling across generations. Even without the ark, the sanctity of the space endured because it represented a cosmic truth understood to transcend material form. The silence within the Holy of Holies was itself a form of testimony. While the outer courts rang with music and the sounds of sacrifice, this chamber remained quiet throughout the year. Only on the Day of Atonement did human footsteps enter, and even then they were marked by caution and solemnity. The high priest's movements were carefully prescribed, reflecting the belief that he entered not simply a room, but a realm of extraordinary holiness. Ancient texts describe the people's tension as they awaited his emergence. His successful return symbolized reconciliation and renewal for the entire nation. The absence of the ark also reshaped discussions about divine presence. Some early writings suggest that the divine presence filled the temple in ways not dependent on physical objects. Others point to the prophetic promises of a future restoration in which the full manifestation of the divine would return. These varied perspectives reflect the theological diversity of Second Temple Judaism. The Holy of Holies served as a focal point for these hopes and debates, representing both what had been lost and what was expected in the future. Archaeological investigation has yielded no surviving remains of the chamber itself, as the temple was destroyed and later structures built atop its location. However, ancient descriptions combined with surviving architectural parallels from other sacred sites allow scholars to reconstruct its dimensions and general form. The stability of these descriptions across sources suggests a widely shared memory of what the innermost chamber looked like during the Second Temple era. The simplicity of the chamber did not diminish its significance. On the contrary, its emptiness invited reflection on the nature of holiness. Rather than focusing on physical artifacts, worshippers looked to ritual, memory, and expectation. The stone foundation symbolized continuity with the past, even as its bare presence indicated a future still unfinished. The chamber's untouched silence became a symbol of the divine mystery that could not be captured in human craftsmanship alone. For priests, scholars, and pilgrims alike, the Holy of Holies represented the core of Israel's faith. It was the inner sanctuary of longing, remembrance, and reverence. And though only one person entered it each year, its meaning radiated outward, shaping the entire temple complex and the spiritual life of the nation. The Holy of Holies, empty yet full of meaning, reveals the most profound secret of the Second Temple, that holiness could endure even in absence, carried forward through ritual, memory, and hope. Deep within the temple complex, beyond the courts, chambers, and ritual furnishings, lay another realm whose influence reached far beyond its walls, the treasury. Though often overshadowed in modern retellings by the grandeur of the sanctuary itself, the temple treasury played a critical role in the religious, economic, and political life of Judea. It stored gifts offered by pilgrims, tithes required by ancient law, and sacred vessels used in worship. It also housed resources that foreign powers coveted, wealth that would draw the attention of empires and shape some of the most dramatic conflicts of the Second Temple period. Ancient writers, especially Josephus, described the treasury as a secure system of chambers located within the temple complex. Not all deposits were kept in a single room. Rather, multiple storerooms held different kinds of offerings. Some chambers contained coins dedicated to the upkeep of the sanctuary. Others stored grain, wine, oil, and precious materials used for sacrifices. Still others safeguarded the donations pilgrims brought from distant regions, small metal vessels, jewelry, or monetary offerings intended to honor the divine. The system was structured with remarkable order. The Mishnah outlines procedures for collecting and distributing funds, ensuring transparency among priests tasked with managing them. Officials known as receivers oversaw contributions, while others handled purchases for sacrificial needs. This administrative network reveals that the temple functioned not only as a religious center, but as an economic institution requiring complex management. Comparable systems found in other ancient temples in Babylon, Egypt, and Anatolia show that sacred economies were central to public life across the ancient Near East. Yet the Jerusalem temple's treasury held a distinctive status. Its resources were tied directly to covenantal commandments and communal identity. This wealth, however, attracted attention from outsiders. Historical accounts record multiple episodes in which foreign rulers attempted to seize or interfere with the temple treasury. The most notorious early example was the action of Antiochus IV, whose attempt to appropriate sacred funds became a catalyst for the Maccabean revolt. His intrusion was perceived not only as theft, but as an attack on the sanctity of the nation's most sacred space. Later rulers, including Roman officials, also eyed the treasury as a source of revenue. Each interference deepened resentment and fueled political tension, reinforcing the idea that the temple was not simply a religious institution, but a symbol of national autonomy. The significance of the treasury extended into the lives of ordinary Judeans. Offerings placed in the temple connected households across the land to its sacred purpose. Farmers brought tithes of grain and produce, which were stored in designated chambers. Pilgrims contributed funds during festivals, supporting both ritual activities and charitable functions. The temple also served as a repository for vows, offerings made in gratitude or petition, that created a personal link between individual stories and the sanctuary's broader mission. Even the famous widow's contribution, remembered in later literature, reflects the belief that every offering, however small, carried spiritual weight. At times, the treasury became entangled in political rivalries among priestly families. Some leaders sought to control access to its resources, perceiving financial influence as a means of consolidating power. These struggles are attested in both historical texts and later rabbinic discussions, revealing how deeply the temple's wealth shaped the internal dynamics of Judean society. Even groups critical of the temple establishment acknowledge the treasury's significance. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, writings express concern over what they viewed as mismanagement, indicating that debates over the temple's resources extended far beyond Jerusalem. The treasury also held sacred vessels used in worship, items of exceptional craftsmanship and religious value. These included bowls, trumpets, containers for incense, and other objects crafted from precious metals. When Pilate, during his governorship, redirected temple funds to finance an aqueduct, public outrage erupted. Josephus records protests that turned violent, illustrating how intertwined the treasury was with the people's sense of sacred responsibility. To divert its funds for secular purposes was to violate a boundary as serious as trespassing into forbidden courts. Roman awareness of the temple's wealth influenced later military actions as well. When tensions escalated in the 1st century, Roman commanders understood that seizing the treasury would not only enrich the empire, but break the spiritual heart of the rebellion. The historian Tacitus mentions the immense expectations surrounding the temple's riches, suggesting that even distant observers viewed it as a repository of extraordinary value. This perception contributed to the tragic events that unfolded in the final years of the temple's existence. The treasury's role extended beyond storage and finance. It shaped social structures throughout Judea. Funds distributed from it supported temple staff, maintained infrastructure, and provided resources for festival rites. It also funded repairs and expansions, including Herod's ambitious reconstruction project. This large-scale undertaking required enormous resources, proof of the treasury's capacity to sustain transformative architectural efforts. The grandeur of the rebuilt temple was due in part to the wealth accumulated over generations through the devotion of pilgrims and the administrative precision of priestly officials. Yet, with wealth came risk. The treasury's presence within the temple made the sanctuary a target for political intervention and military ambition. Its riches formed part of the story of Judea's resistance, shaping strategies, rebellions, and negotiations. The temple treasury symbolized not merely financial assets, but the spiritual treasure of a nation, safeguarded within the most sacred precincts of Jerusalem. As the Second Temple approached its final decades, the treasury became increasingly entangled in the growing tensions between Judean groups and Roman authority. Disputes over control of its resources contributed to the unrest that would eventually erupt into open conflict. These conflicts reveal a deeper truth. The temple was not only a place of prayer and sacrifice, but a center of national identity whose wealth fortified hope and fueled resistance. The treasury's fate, like that of the temple itself, would be caught in the storm of history. Its story prepares the way for understanding the forces that converged in the final years of the Second Temple, a period marked by expectation, fear, and the belief that monumental change was approaching. In the final decades of the Second Temple's existence, Jerusalem stood at the crossroads of profound religious expectation and escalating political turmoil. What unfolded within its walls was shaped not only by ancient traditions, but by the rising tensions between Judean communities and the expanding power of Rome. Inside the temple, rituals continued with precision. Offerings rose from the altar each day, and pilgrims filled the courts during major festivals. Yet beneath the ordered rhythm of worship, a sense of strain deepened, one that would eventually erupt into one of the most consequential turning points in Jewish history. The temple leadership itself was fractured. Competing priestly families vied for influence, some aligning with Roman interests, while others resisted foreign involvement. Sources from this era describe high priests appointed and removed at the discretion of imperial authorities, a practice that undermined traditional notions of lineage and legitimacy. For many Judeans, this intrusion into sacred leadership signaled a deepening spiritual crisis. Groups such as the Essenes, whose writings are preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, interpreted these developments as signs of corruption that could only be remedied through divine intervention and the establishment of a renewed priesthood. At the same time, apocalyptic expectation grew stronger across Judea. Early Jewish writings from this period reflect a widespread belief that history was approaching a moment of decisive transformation. Texts such as those found at Qumran speak of heavenly sanctuaries, angelic armies, and a final purification of the earthly temple. Even writings preserved in later Christian literature echo a sense that the temple's days were bound to a larger cosmic drama. Whether understood politically or spiritually, these expectations reveal a society interpreting its present tensions through the lens of prophetic hope. The temple itself remained the axis of these hopes and fears. Each festival drew enormous crowds, intensifying the emotions connected to the sanctuary. Josephus describes gatherings where pilgrims from across the Mediterranean world converged on Jerusalem, carrying memories of exile, longing, and identity. To them, the temple was not merely a building, but the heart of the covenant, a tangible reminder of divine presence and ancestral promise. Every ritual, every chant, every rising cloud of incense reinforced the belief that holiness dwelled in this place. Yet Rome's presence loomed ever larger. Procurators oversaw taxation, managed military garrisons, and interfered in local governance. Incidents of disrespect toward Jewish customs, some accidental, others deliberate, fueled resentment. The temple treasury, with its immense resources, became a flashpoint when Roman officials attempted to redirect its funds for imperial projects. Public protests recorded by ancient historians often erupted on the temple grounds, underscoring the emotional power the sanctuary held for the people. The outbreak of the First Jewish Revolt intensified these dynamics. Rebel groups seized control of Jerusalem, including the temple complex. Some attempted to restore priestly practices according to their own interpretations, while others saw the temple as a fortified stronghold necessary for resisting Roman siege. These groups clashed not only with external enemies but with one another, turning the sanctuary into a battleground for competing visions of national destiny. Ancient accounts describe internal conflicts that spilled into the courts themselves, reflecting the fragmentation of Judean society at the very center of its sacred life. When the Roman forces, led by Titus, encircled Jerusalem, the temple became the focus of both strategic and symbolic confrontation. The siege was brutal, its details preserved in vivid accounts by Josephus. Hunger, desperation, and infighting plagued the city, yet many held hope that divine intervention would preserve the sanctuary. The belief that the temple represented an eternal covenant fueled resistance, even as the situation grew dire. Rituals continued as long as possible, a testament to the nation's determination to uphold holiness in the face of overwhelming force. The final assault on the temple brought devastation. Despite attempts by some Roman commanders to preserve the structure, the chaos of battle and the intensity of resistance led to its destruction. Flames engulfed the courts, consuming the cedar beams and melting the golden ornaments. The treasures of the sanctuary were seized and taken to Rome, memorialized in triumphal monuments that still stand. The Holy of Holies, empty yet sacred, collapsed into ruins. The stone that had stood in place of the ark was buried beneath layers of fallen masonry. The center of Israel's worship, identity, and hope had been torn apart. Yet the destruction of the temple was not the end of its story. Its memory endured in literature, liturgy, and longing. Early Jewish writings composed after the catastrophe sought to preserve its rituals and architectural details, ensuring that future generations would not forget what once stood on the heights of Jerusalem. New forms of worship emerged, shaped by prayer, study, and communal gathering, yet rooted in the memory of the temple's rhythms. The sanctuary lived on in the psalms recited daily, in the cycles of fasting and remembrance, and in the enduring hope for restoration. Archaeological discoveries over the past century have brought fragments of this lost world back into view. Stone vessels, inscriptions, mikveh installations, and monumental architecture scattered across Jerusalem offer glimpses into the life that once centered around the temple. These remains, paired with the writings of ancient witnesses, allow historians to reconstruct a detailed picture of the Second Temple's grandeur and significance. What emerges is a portrait of an institution that shaped not only the spiritual life of a nation, but its cultural, social, and political identity. The true secret of the Second Temple lies not only in what was physically inside it, but in what it represented, a meeting point between humanity and the divine, a testament to ancient memory, a symbol of endurance in the face of empire, and a source of hope whose influence extends far beyond its stones. Though its walls fell, its meaning endured, carried in texts, traditions, and the collective imagination of countless generations. The temple's story, spanning centuries of devotion and conflict, reveals a world where holiness was pursued with profound dedication. Its courts, its rituals, its mysteries, and its final destruction continue to shape the spiritual landscape of millions today. Even in ruins, it remains one of history's most enduring sanctuaries, a monument not merely of stone, but of memory, longing, and faith.